Welcome to the Women Inspired Podcast, brought to you by Modern Well, a beautiful woman-centered collaborative workspace in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm your host, April Seifert, psychologist, entrepreneur, and self-proclaimed life experience junkie. Each week, I will introduce you to a different woman who is succeeding and inspiring others in one way or another. We'll dive into her story, her successes, failures, and the lessons she has learned along the way, all with the goal of inspiring you to listen to that inner voice who keeps reminding you that there is something you want to take action on. You are so much more capable and powerful than you give yourself credit for. Inside of you is a woman on fire. Let's let her out and see what happens. Here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Women Inspired Podcast. My name is April Seifert, and I am your host. And this week, we have a wonderful guest who is here to share just a beautifully authentic and open story that has led her to start doing some work that is just so impactful for the people that she works with. And I know it's going to be so impactful for all of us on this episode. So I am just thrilled to introduce all of you to Shala Nicely. Welcome, Shala, to the podcast.
Thank you, April, so much. I'm honored to be here.
So you and I actually got introduced through a former guest of mine and a former graduate school colleague of mine, Ashley Smith. I'd have to look up her episode number. A better prepared person would have done that by now, but I'll link to her on your show notes page for those who are interested in listening to Ashley's background. But all of us sort of share this psychology background, which is really fun. And it's always fun when a former guest can think of, another amazing, inspiring woman to introduce me to bring on. So I'm really excited that Ashley introduced us. That's awesome.
Yes, me too. And she's been incredibly inspiring for me since I had the wonderful opportunity to meet her probably 5 or 6 years ago.
That's awesome. Well, on that note, let's all spend just a minute to get to know each other. Specifically, we want to get to know you. So tell us a little bit about your background before we dive into all the amazing work that you're doing today.
So my background is varied. Currently, I am a therapist focusing on the treatment of OCD and related disorders, but I have a pretty zigzaggy way that I got here. I started out as a salesperson out of college and did that for 5 or 6 years, and then decided that really wasn't for me and thought, well, maybe if I just go back to school and get an MBA, then I'll be happier. So I went back to school, got an MBA, and then did marketing for tech startups here in Atlanta. And I did that for probably, 8 to 10 years. But wasn't really all that happy doing that either. I sort of liked the adrenaline of working in tech and working in sales. But it really wasn't meeting all of my needs. And so probably just about the time, I guess it was around 2010, I was really thinking, I need to do something different than marketing. This whole time, I've had untreated obsessive-compulsive disorder, and I actually have had OCD probably since I was 5 or 6, and I was hiding it from everyone. And I was really highly functional. Nobody could tell that I had OCD. But it took every ounce of strength I had to manage it and to pull off this facade of normalcy during the day. And I'd come home and just fall apart. And I had tried a variety of things to work on my OCD, seen a variety of different mental health professionals. Nothing had worked. I'd pretty much decided I must be unfixable. And I had recognized that though I was maybe unfixable, I was managing my OCD. And I thought, well, maybe if I could share my story with other people, maybe I could sort of break this silence I'd had for so many years and share my story with other people of how I was sort of managing living with this monster in my head and still being okay. Maybe that would help me and others. And so I decided to look up OCD online in 2010, which is the first time I'd ever done so, and found the International OCD Foundation. And they were having a conference in Washington, D.C. that year. And it was about 2 weeks after I looked on the internet. So it was coming up. And so I decided to go. And at that very first conference, the very first session I went to, the presenter said, well, we all know the gold standard treatment for OCD is exposure and response prevention therapy. And I thought, we do? Because I certainly didn't know that. And that began this switch in really my career and really a change in my whole life, because I had suffered for so long without anybody telling me about exposure and response prevention therapy, which is an evidence-based treatment. It's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that works exceptionally well for OCD. And so at that conference, I decided, well, clearly I've got to go get this ERP therapy. But what if I also, in addition to getting it for myself, what if I learned how to give it to other people? And so I signed up for graduate school right when I got back from that conference to do a master's in counseling. And I did my master's in counseling and worked on my own OCD at the same time. And then started doing a lot of advocacy work, recognizing that I wasn't the only one who was struggling like this, who was going for years and years and years without getting the right treatment. In fact, the stats are it takes somebody with OCD 14 to 17 years from the time that symptoms first occur before they get the right treatment.
Wow.
And mine was almost twice that long. And so I decided clearly this is an issue. And so I started doing a lot of advocacy work. And through the International OCD Foundation, I met a lot of other people, therapists, other people with OCD who were also doing advocacy work, and managed to hook up with some of them, created a venture called Beyond the Doubt with my friend Jeff Bell, who also has OCD and has done advocacy work for years. And so we now have a venture where we help people try to learn how to thrive through uncertainty. OCD is based on an intolerance of uncertainty. And so we do all sorts of workshops and e-courses and motivational emails, helping people learn how to do that using the principles of exposure and response prevention therapy. Another friend, John Hirschfield, asked me to write a book with him. So we wrote Everyday Mindfulness for OCD, Tips, Tricks, and Skills for Living Joyfully. And that was published last year. And that was really fun. And so I've just had a lot of different opportunities to be able to work with other people to use what happened to me for the good, to be able to help people get the right treatment a lot faster than I did. The biggest thing that I wanted to do for myself is I wanted to break OCD's rule number one. So that is the edict that my OCD has given me ever since I was a little kid, which is you cannot tell what you see and think, because if you do, you'll make all that happen. And so that's why I never told anybody, because I thought that's how I was keeping people safe. That's how I was keeping me safe. And I thought if I could break that in a really big way, then I would really be giving a fatal blow to my OCD. I'd really be helping myself take my life back while I was also helping other people. So I submitted my story to the International OCD Foundation conference to give the keynote. And so in 2013, I gave the keynote there. And that was a pretty big breaking of rule number one, because there were probably about 1,000 people in the audience.
Yeah, I would say. I would say that's fairly breaking that rule completely into tiny pieces.
Yeah. And so my OCD wasn't pleased about that, which is great because I do everything I can to keep my OCD unhappy. So that was good. But I also wanted to go further. I wanted to write a book about it. I wanted to really unveil OCD for what it is. I wanted to share all its dirty little secrets because OCD gets so much power from the shame that it inflicts on everyone who has it. And so I wanted to just put it all out there and help people understand this is what it's like to have OCD. I also have body dysmorphic disorder, which is a cousin of OCD, which I didn't even figure out until a couple of years ago. And so I talk about that too, because it's as nasty of a devil as OCD is. And so I wanted to really help people understand what that is like and try to help people understand there's no shame in having these things by just sort of laying it all out there and saying, this is my experience. This is what it's like, but you can get better and you should never give up.
You are so incredibly brave. I mean, to think about, the way that you described getting up in front of that group of people and giving that keynote as though, it's breaking rule number one, this foundational rule of this life that you've lived. I mean, if you are saying it's gone back to being, when you were 5 years old, this is your whole life. You have lived by that rule and you're getting up and you're breaking it. That is incredibly brave. And then to continue to do it in so many ways by writing books and by speaking and, other avenues to help advocate for other people. That is so incredibly brave.
Well, thank you. I think it's really necessary for me. It's part of my therapy to do this. And I think that exposure therapy, while it's incredibly effective, it does take an incredible amount of courage to do it. I think all of us who've done ERP could say that. And I think the more that we do it and the more that we are brave, the braver we feel and the more that we can do, the more that we can really lean into life and lean into the discomfort that really makes life meaningful. So it's really important to me. And I think it's also important to other people because OCD is such a silent condition. And so many people suffer in silence and suffer needlessly for years, like I did, feeling alone, feeling like they're the worst person in the world. I want them to know that there's at least one other person out there that thought she was as bad as they are, and we're not, and they can get better too.
That's so incredible. I want to go back a little bit for, the folks that are listening to this. Some people may have firsthand knowledge with OCD as a condition and what that might look like and what the experience might be like for someone who has lived with it. And probably many of my people in my audience, and certainly myself included, don't. And so I'm wondering if you're willing to share a bit about, you mentioned you knew that this was the case back when you were 5 years old. Can you share a little bit about what your experience was? Like, how did you know, and what were the symptoms and the things that you were dealing with and the pieces that you had to manage in your day-to-day life to be able to be as functioning as you were?
So sure, happy to share that. So my OCD has morphed over the years. There's an infinite variety of things that you can have OCD about, and I've had almost all of them. When I was a child, what would happen to me is I would see really violent scenes in my head. I would see my parents lying under a guillotine. That was one of my OCD's favorites. It loved to show me that. I would see animals being tortured because I've always been a huge animal person. So I would, close my eyes at night and I'd see all my pets being tortured. And those types of things, were incredibly frightening. And I also, because of rule number one, I felt like I couldn't tell anybody about them. So what I started doing was a variety of rituals in secret where I would replay them. I would turn it into a movie. I'd tell myself, oh, that's just a bad movie I'm seeing in my head. And I'm going to redo it into a movie with a happy ending where my parents are pulled out from the guillotine by a knight in shining armor riding something that looked like the Black Stallion and rode off into the sunset. And so I'd play these little movies in my head. I did a lot of praying as a kid. Down on my knees on the carpet for 10, 20, 30 minutes, doing these prayers over and over and over again, asking God to make sure that no one ever died and everybody was safe. And, please make sure everybody's okay always. And it had a very specific rhythm to the prayer, and I had to do it perfectly. And after I started doing these things, I recognized that they had to feel right as I was doing them. And so I would do them 4 times because to my OCD, 4 is perfect. It loves 4 because it's symmetrical, and my OCD loves symmetry. And so I would do things 4 times. But if I was really tired, that wouldn't be enough. And so I'd have to do it 4 times 4 or 16 times because I was certain to get at least one of the iterations of whatever I was doing perfect if I would do it that many times. And so this was just exhausting. And it was very important to me that I didn't get caught by my parents or anybody else doing any of this, because that facade of normalcy, my OCD from a very young age said, we must be normal. No one can know about this. This is our little secret. And so I would do all this stuff and my parents never knew. I never got busted. But I was exhausted. If you look at all my elementary school photos as a little kid, I have these huge dark circles. It looks like somebody's smudged black chalk under my eyes because I was exhausted. Because a lot of this would happen at night and I would do it at night. And so I never slept very well. But I also had this facade of what I wanted to be perfection, because what my mind also told me was that the fact that I had these thoughts meant I was flawed, defective as a person. But if maybe I could be perfect enough, a perfect daughter, a perfect student, a perfect friend, if I could garner praise and admiration for what I did, then maybe who I wasn't so bad. And so I became a perfectionist at a pretty early age to make up for all of this that I was experiencing in my mind. And so that's what people saw. And it was a real dichotomy with what I was actually experiencing, because I was outwardly projecting an aura of a perfect, happy child, and inside I was in hell.
This is so interesting because, and I'm really curious about your reaction to what I'm about to say, specifically from the perspective of the work you've done as an advocate. So as you're describing that, I'm hearing you talk about an intolerance for uncertainty. I'm hearing you talk about this way that you want to clutch to perfection, that you're hiding some of these imperfect or things that you might feel ashamed of, these pieces, you're hiding those from other people, and this desire to protect other people. So many times within, let me start on one side of the coin. It's really easy to hear something like OCD or bipolar disorder or name a diagnosis in psychology. It's really easy to hear that and think, wow, that's very different from me. I'm very far away from that. And it's easy to sort of dissociate, and because of that, lose empathy and lose the ability to work to understand and to make a connection. What's interesting about what you're saying is it's starting to highlight, a lot of these things from the, training in my background. We talk about things on a continuum. And when things get far enough on that continuum, it's when, they start to really impact people's lives and that type of thing. What is your thought about, using that continuum as a way to gain empathy and as a way to understand, even to the tiniest degree? Because I don't think you can ever really understand completely unless you're in that position, to some degree, to open your mind to understand what that person might be going from, instead of like marginalizing and pushing away and drawing a sharp line between us and them. I'm really curious about that, if that made any sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of my really good friends recently texted me and said, there's something in my life that's going on right now, and I cannot stop thinking about it. And she goes, it makes me think of you and what you must have gone through. And so I think that what you're saying is exactly correct, in that while not everybody has OCD or not everybody has bipolar, people can have characteristics of a variety of different things. People can have things that they're incredibly worried about. And that could give them a flavor of, gosh, think about if I worried about this all the time for years. Like, how would that feel? How would that impact my life? And yes, so I think that, we can all take things that might happen to us and be able to say, gosh, what if this were the case all the time? I think depression's another really good example. We all feel sad and blue every now and then. And if we, take that opportunity to think, gosh, what if I felt like this all the time? And what if I could not pull myself out of it, no matter what I did? How horrible would that be? And I think that is, the building block to being able to have empathy and then compassion for others who are suffering from these things on a clinical diagnosable level, who feel like they just can't get out of, this particular worry or get out of the depression, and how debilitating that must be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I can also see where it could go too far, and you could go too far down that path and start to equate the wrong behaviors to the wrong diagnosis. You hear people say, oh, that was really OCD of me, or gosh, I'm so OCD, or make sort of lighthearted comments, or what they feel like are lighthearted comments. You could also go in that direction. And I'm curious about your thoughts about the impact of some of those, those comments.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about that, because I think when people say things like that, they don't mean any harm. I think what's happened in our culture is that OCD has become synonymous with detail-oriented, meticulous, fastidious. And that's unfortunate, mostly for the people who have OCD where it's untreated. For me, when I hear something like that, it makes me sad, but it doesn't sort of impact my life. But I have clients who are really struggling, have very severe OCD, and no one knows. And then they hear somebody say that. This is especially common with kids, where kids will say this and other little kids are struggling and nobody knows except, their parents. And it makes them feel ashamed, because they're like, well, if people can say it's just so OCD, why can't I get over this? If it's that trivial, why is my life being ruined by this? Why is this taking me years? Why am I on all these medications? Why is this so hard? So they feel marginalized by the comments because they think, gosh, if somebody's going to treat OCD as an adjective that just means meticulous, what I have must not be that bad. And what's wrong with me that I just can't get over it? And I think that's the tough thing. But I think the thing is, when people are saying that, I really don't think people are meaning it in a harmful way. And in fact, when I have clients who come to me and say, I'm a little afraid to get rid of my OCD because I think it keeps me really organized, and I'm afraid my life will fall apart if I don't get rid of this, or if I do get rid of this. And what I'll tell them, and as I said, there is a difference between the detail-oriented part of you and the OCD part of you. And you can be detail-oriented and meticulous and organized and not have OCD be running your life. I said, in fact, OCD is making your life harder. And if you give credit to the OCD as being what is causing you to be successful, then you are giving the very thing that's trying to ruin your life power. Wow. And I said, what we want to do is pull the OCD out so you can be detailed and meticulous and goal-oriented and organized. And you will be more successful if we can get the OCD out of there. It is not the OCD that's successful, it's you. And the more that we pull that out, the more successful you'll be.
Oh my God, I just got chills when you said that. Like, it's not the OCD that's successful, it's you. I feel like in general, people tend to just make these, I don't know, not excuses isn't the right word, but they tend to downplay the power that they have. And I love that you're giving that back to your patients and saying the amazingly powerful, incredible things you're doing are you. And this is something entirely separate from that. I just think that's so cool. I kind of want to turn a corner a little bit and talk about how you do that, because you mentioned a bit about your practice and about some of the work that you're doing today. You mentioned exposure response prevention therapy and other things like that. I'm curious about how you work with people and what does this look like when somebody comes to you who is really struggling?
Sure. So how I work with people is really helping understand what their OCD is afraid of. So it's a lot of detective work. I sort of think when we start out, we've got this adversary that's very cunning and very manipulative and has a big stake in keeping things the way they are. And we have to understand what its pain points are so we can go after those. So I have people, develop a list of what their OCD is afraid of. And I always try to say it like that too. It's not what they're afraid of. It's what their OCD is afraid of, because it's incredibly important to separate the person from the disorder. And so we'll make a list. The technical term is a hierarchy of the things that bother the OCD. And then we'll start working on facing those together. And I give people a lot of skills to help them feel like they can face it. And one of the most important skills is the way that we view anxiety. Nobody likes anxiety because, it's a byproduct of the fight or flight response. From an evolutionary perspective, it means we're in danger. But OCD is using that against people because these obsessions that people have make them incredibly anxious. And compulsions, whether they're mental compulsions, like what I did as a kid, mental movie making, or physical compulsions, which might be praying or checking or asking for reassurance or all sorts of things. Those compulsions are being done to pull anxiety down. OCD tells people that you're doing compulsions to prevent something from happening or to change, if it's some people have just right OCD where they feel like things feel wrong. And so they think the compulsions they're doing so they can handle feeling better. But really, all the compulsions are about is pulling that anxiety down. And so what we do is we teach people that anxiety is nothing but a set of physical sensations that we're interpreting as being bad. And that we need to interpret those physical sensations as, hey, I can handle this. In fact, I want this anxiety to stay there, because if I can harness the power of this anxiety and throw it back at the OCD, it can't get me to do compulsions. Because if I'm doing compulsions solely to pull my anxiety down, if I turn the tables and say, I'm fine being anxious OCD, you can have all these obsessions all you want, I'm not doing anything about them. Now you've stripped OCD's power down by about half. So we teach people to lean into the anxiety, to want the anxiety. Once they have an understanding of that concept, then we start actually going after some stuff on their hierarchy. So going after things that they're afraid of. If they're afraid of germs, then we touch a bunch of things all over my office that are potentially germy. And if you can see me, I'm using air quotes there because, that's everything's germy, right? But
right.
OCD, it's like, it's contaminated. We touch a bunch of stuff and then we don't do any rituals. And then we say a lot of scripts out loud, things like, I can handle this. I want this. Give me another thought, OCD. This is fine. Yeah, it may or may not be contaminated, but hey, I want to do this because I want to get better and I can do this and I am doing this. So a lot of positive statements about their power, recognizing that they are doing this and they are winning. And then it's a matter of just helping them really troubleshoot the process, because once you start doing exposure, OCD retaliates. I mean, it's an incredibly aggressive disorder.
This literally sounds like trying to do sort of behavior modification things with like 2-year-olds. Like OCD is this stubborn 2-year-old and you have forced it to eat its dinner and it's just going to ramp it up and like come back to get you.
Yes, that's exactly how to think about it. I mean, OCD is like dealing with a toddler. And it throws tantrums. It has very specific ways it thinks about things, very black and white. And when you don't do what it wants, I mean, it throws a tantrum in the middle of the floor. And unfortunately, when you have it, your emotions are tied to it. So when it's throwing a tantrum, I mean, you feel like your chest is on fire and you're going to explode. But if you can, get through that and in fact sort of throw it back at the OCD and say, you think that's bad OCD? Let me show you what I'm about to do now. Now you've taken more of the power away from it as you're working on these exposures. And I think treating it like a toddler and thinking of it like a toddler, but it's a devious toddler, and recognizing that it's detective work to figure out how it's sabotaging what you're doing. And it's very sneaky. And unfortunately, people's OCD is as smart as they are. And that's what I tell them. I'm like, you're really smart. So your OCD is really smart too. So it's going to take us a little while here to figure out what it's doing so we can work against that. It's fun. It's really like detective work.
That's amazing. I want to branch off of that, like from the work you're doing to a really cool piece that you've put out into the world recently, because that's sort of another way that you're helping people in addition to the therapy and the one-on-one work that you're doing. You recently wrote a book that has a very curiosity-piquing title. You wrote a book called Is Fred in the Refrigerator? Tell us a little bit about why you wrote that book. What's it about? Like, give us the lowdown on Fred.
Yeah. So Is Fred in the Refrigerator? Taming OCD and Reclaiming My Life has been a project that I've worked on for the past 8 years. I wrote it for 3 reasons. One is because I think it's hard for people to understand what it really feels like to have OCD. As we've discussed today, most people just see sort of the outward compulsions, or they see people being neat and orderly and that kind of thing. But that is just the tip of the iceberg with OCD. And OCD can look on the outside like it's cute and quirky, and it's not. It's horrific. And so the first reason I wanted to write this is I wanted to help people understand how it feels, that what it feels like is walking around with a gun pressed to your head all day long, and that you will do whatever your OCD says because you're not sure if you don't do what it wants, if it's going to pull the trigger.
That's terrifying.
It's terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying.
And so somebody who has active untreated OCD sort of feels like they've got a gun to their head all day long. And I thought it was really important to help people understand that. And the way that I did that is, so my OCD is a character in the book. It is the adversary. It is the villain. Eventually, body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD, sort of joins it, and they're co-conspirators. And you can see how it talks to me. It is ruthless. It is mean. It is demeaning. It is demanding. And, it won't take no for an answer. And it just makes your life hell. And I think you can see the way it talks to me, the way I interact with it, the way it could sabotage my getting help and therapy. You sort of see what a monster it really is. So that was the first reason I wrote it. The second reason is, something that I've alluded to earlier, is that I want people to know that they can get better and that it's not an easy path to getting better, oftentimes because it just takes people so long to get the right treatment, because people don't talk about it, because unfortunately there aren't a lot of people trained in exposure and response prevention. It takes people so long to get the right treatment. And many people, by the time they see an exposure and response prevention therapist, they will have seen a number of other therapists, and they come thinking they're unfixable. And they come thinking there must be something fundamentally wrong with them. And I want people to understand that's not true and that they shouldn't ever give up, because it took me 35 years before I learned about ERP. And then really it took me about 8 years, about the time that I spent working on the book, to really sort of get my OCD under control. And it's not going to take everybody 8 years. It took me 8 years. Because of some choices I made about therapy. I did most of my therapy on my own. So a lot of mine was trial and error. And so that made it take longer. And I also, had really aggressive, assertive OCD. It'd been around for 35 years. It was pretty skilled at its job. So it took a long time to dismantle all that. And so I want people to understand that they can get better and not to give up. Even if it's been 35 years or 45 years or 55 years or whatever, don't give up. They can get better. And then finally, I wanted to write a good story. I wanted to write a page turner because that's what I like to read. I love mystery novels because there's always that sense of what's going to happen next. And so it was important to me to write a really good story, because one of the things I've learned from my mother, who's a professional storyteller, is that the best way to convey information in a way that people will remember is to tell a good story. And so I really wanted to create something that people would want to read, that would be interesting. And then along the way, they'll happen to learn about OCD and they'll happen to learn how you can get better.
I love all of those goals. I mean, they're all so incredibly important, especially you sharing your story and being so open about what your experience was really like, with the goal of helping other people, basically putting your vulnerability out there and helping other people realize that, they have permission to do the same thing, and that they can also, really combat and come back and live a thriving life the way that you have. That is so wonderful. Give us a little direction here. Where can people find your book? Where can people find you? And particularly, there's kind of two audiences I want to call out here. People who maybe don't suspect that they have OCD, they don't, and whatever, but they're curious, or maybe somebody they know do, or maybe they just want to learn a little bit more. I want their ears to perk up right now. And also, if somebody out there is listening to this and anything that Shala has shared is making you start to wonder and making you start to question whether the way that you've been living might indicate that you need help, I want your ears to perk up right now too. So help direct us. Where can we find you? Where can we find your book?
Sure. So you can find me on my website, shalanicely.com, as well as my website for my advocacy venture with Jeff Bell, which is beyondthedoubt.com. Jeff and I actually do a daily motivational email for people who have OCD called Keywords, that's free, that you can sign up for at our Beyond the Doubt website. I also blog for Psychology Today about my experience with OCD, so you can find me there. And that's really fun because, again, it's sharing the perspective of having and treating OCD. And one of the things I really like to do there is talk about how it's an imperfect process, and I'm imperfect, and they can be imperfect too, and that's okay. In terms of the book, you can find it on Amazon. So the Kindle version is available for pre-order. The book will actually be launched on May 29th, and both the print and the Kindle version will be available on May 29th.
Yay!
Yay!
That's so exciting.
Thank you. I think so too.
This has been absolutely wonderful. And, before I close out every single interview, I always thank my guests for coming on and sharing their story. But you in particular, knowing what you've shared with us and the emotional and psychological stakes that were at hand for you to start speaking about what you were experiencing, it makes this an even bigger deal. I mean, I always am so appreciative of my guests when they come on and they share their authentic, full open story, and they're able to be a little bit vulnerable with me. But in your case, the stakes were twice as high. And so I so appreciate you being able to, share your story and share the work that you're doing and share this book with the world, all with the hopes of helping other people, carving a path for other people who are coming after you to show them that there absolutely is a path out there. I'm so appreciative of you being here today.
Well, thank you. It's been a real honor to talk with you. I appreciate the opportunity to share information about my story because, again, it's just really important to me that I can use what happened to me for good for other people. So thank you.
I love it. Now, before I let you go, I have one final question. I ask every single interviewee, every single guest, for her favorite motivational song to add to our Spotify Power playlist. So I have to ask for your favorite motivational song.
So my favorite motivational song comes from the 80s because I'm an 80s girl. That's when I was a teenager.
Yes. I wasn't a teenager, but I was alive for almost all of the 80s. And
And 80s music is great. I think it's so fun and empowering. And the one that I have loved since I was a teenager is the theme song to St. Elmo's Fire. It's just a traditional 80s feel good, you can do this anthem. So that's my favorite.
I love it. That's awesome. It's not on there. So you have added a brand new one to the list. I love it.
Wonderful.
Shala, like I said, this has been so wonderful. I am so appreciative of you coming on, and I absolutely can't wait to share your story with my audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, April.
I really hope you guys loved that episode with Shala Nicely. I feel like, I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like I learned a ton from her. It was just one of those conversations where I felt like the guest that I was interviewing really gave me a new perspective on an area that I just didn't know a whole lot about. And that is always so valuable to me. As usual, I want to call out a few things from our conversation. Number one, oh my gosh, I love it when people can do what Shala did. She took her own difficult situation, her own brutal situation with OCD from little on. So much of her life, she experienced this hardship. She took that experience and she turned it into something that can help other people. She basically took her experience, figured out how to solve her own problem, and then instead of just continuing on her way, she is helping pave the way for people who are coming after her. And there is a reason why there's a playlist devoted entirely to women who help pave the way for others. It is such an important and valuable thing that we can all do for each other. And I am so incredibly impressed with the way that Shala has devoted her career to helping to pave the way for other people who suffer from OCD. Second, I love the way that she talked about flexing this muscle or working on this muscle of uncertainty. I don't think that's the words she used, but essentially she started talking about how as you start to challenge your OCD, it'll rear its ugly head and it'll come back and it's going to try to, beat you back into submission. But then you come back even stronger and you keep working on it and you keep working on it. And I've talked about this with a number of guests in the past where a variety of things, your tolerance for risk, your tolerance for uncertainty, the degree to which you can handle fear, all of those things are like a muscle. If you start really small, start with something that is only slightly uncomfortable today, you can begin to work toward something that it just feels impossible from where you're standing today. Slowly, slowly, slowly making progress over time, similar to how you would exercise an actual physical muscle. You might start lifting 5 pounds today, and that might be challenging. But in a couple of weeks, maybe you can lift 8 pounds, and that's more than you did before. And then a little while after that, you can probably lift 10, and that is double what you were doing when you began. And so I love that she talked about how that is part of the work that she does with people. Last, it was so sensitive of her and so vulnerable of her. During the conversation, we talked about how damaging it can be when people make sort of offhanded comments about people who have OCD, like, oh, that was so OCD of me, or there goes my OCD, ha, ha, ha. Because, the way that she describes it, OCD is like somebody walking around with a gun held to their head every day. That is terrifying. If you really put yourself in that perspective and in that situation, that would be so terrifying. But as somebody who is an advocate and as somebody who is an educator and has decided to take that on herself, so she's decided to devote her career to this, it's just amazing to me and so big of her and incredible of her that she can look at people who, their comments are hurting other people, but she can look at them and say, you know what? I don't think there was any malintent there. I don't think they meant for their comments to be as damaging as they are. Now, I'm still going to take this opportunity and help educate that person, but I'm going to recognize that that person really didn't mean to cause the hurt that they did. And that is just an incredibly sensitive, thoughtful way to approach the advocacy and education work that she has made such a large part of her career. I really, really hope you guys took a lot away from this episode. And I mentioned it during the episode, but it is worth calling out again. If there's anybody out there who, listened to this episode and, started to think about some of the things that Shala said and they are something that you might identify with, I can't tell you how big of a proponent of therapy I am. There have been a number of points in my life where I've needed a neutral third party to help me sort through a really big, difficult issue. And that's essentially what a therapist does. And so if anything that she was talking about resonates with you and you identify with it and you think that maybe you might need a little bit of help, or you have been keeping these symptoms a secret the way that Shala did, I highly encourage you to reach out. I highly encourage you, if anything even, go find Shala on her website and reach out to her at minimum. It's so worth it. It is so worth to put the time and effort into yourself to improve your situation if there is something there that is standing in your way of living the biggest, most fulfilling life you possibly can. Before we close out today, I want to say thank you to my producer, Cameron Hill, and to my incredible sponsor, Modern Well. If you want to learn more about how you can reach your goals in a one-of-a-kind work-life community, visit www.modernwell.co. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who might benefit from this inspiring message. And if you have a moment, click the link in the episode description to leave me a rating and a review on iTunes. It would mean so much to me. Finally, I want to remind you that it is absolutely possible to live a happy, fulfilling life, even in spite of all of the chaos and demands we all experience. Sign up at aprilseifert.com to gain access to tools that will help you do just that. I have carefully created and curated a set of tools that combine the powerful fields of psychology and design thinking to help you intentionally create a fulfilling, happy life you love. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and until next week, stay inspired.